What if royalty wasn't about duty but about loot? Behind the velvet thrones and jewelled crowns lies a darker legacy of kings who sold empires for pocket change, sultans who turned nations into storefronts, and emperors who ran their courts like cash registers. This isn't history with a halo. It's a guided tour through 30 royal courts where corruption wasn't the exception, it was the business model. From palace intrigues to stolen treasuries, these are the monarchs who ruled not by divine right, but by receipt. Welcome to 30 most corrupt royals in history. Let's follow the money. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, especially if you like your history dark, unfiltered, and a little too real. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight rabbit hole, lunchtime escape, we're listening. 1. Leopold II of Belgium. By the late 19th century, Leopold II had mastered a peculiar kind of magic trick, the ability to turn humanitarianism into profit and murder into paperwork. He didn't need to lead armies or pass laws. All he needed was the illusion of benevolence and a country so far away from Belgium that most of his own citizens wouldn't know how to spell it. The Congo Free State wasn't a colony in the traditional sense. It was a personal holding. Not Belgium's, his, as in the private property of King Leopold II. This little arrangement was secured at the 1885 Berlin Conference, where European powers gathered like attendees at a real estate auction for continents they didn't live on. Leopold pitched himself as a reformer, a philanthropist, a man who wanted to civilize Africa with schools and Christianity. What he actually did was lease out vast sections of Congo to private companies, often just shell entities with royal backing, in exchange for tribute and silence. Rubber and ivory were the cash cows. Human lives were the overhead. Villages were given quotas for rubber extraction, and failure to meet them meant brutal punishment. Enforced not by the king himself, of course, but by the force publique. His private army composed largely of African conscripts and white officers. The punishments were systematic, bureaucratized, and always deniable. Every finger severed or family abducted became another line in the ledger of plausible deniability. What's striking isn't just the scale of the atrocities, millions dead, untold suffering, but how early the masks slipped. Even in his own lifetime, Leopold was denounced not just by exiled revolutionaries or later historians, but by his own countrymen, by missionaries, by British diplomats, by African witnesses who risked their lives to speak. The Casement Report, filed in 1904 by British consul Roger Casement, documented horrors so extensive that even the Belgian Parliament, a group not exactly known for its radicalism, was forced to investigate. That same year, the Congo Reform Association was formed to lobby for change. When your business model is so rotten that you accidentally invent modern human rights activism, you've probably gone too far. But here's the real trick. By the time the outrage peaked, Leopold had already cashed out. He'd taken the profits, estimated at hundreds of millions in today's dollars, and turned them into monuments, literally. Parks, museums, and architectural projects across Belgium still bear the aesthetic legacy of the Congo's stolen wealth. He transformed blood into marble and named it Progress. When international pressure finally forced him to hand over the Congo Free State to the Belgian government in 1908, he didn't do it in shame. He did it with the grumbling reluctance of a man giving up his favorite investment property. He died the following year, unloved by his people, ridiculed in satire, but never prosecuted. Statues were still built, plaques were still engraved. A bad king, perhaps, but an excellent real estate speculator. And yet, even as Leopold faded into infamy, another royal was already taking notes on how to run a court like a business empire. Only this one wouldn't need a colony to loot. He'd do it from the comfort of his own throne, by turning politics into profit and his inner circle into a well-oiled racket. 2. Carol II of Romania. Carol II of Romania did not inherit a poor country, but he did inherit a fragile one. Romania in the interwar years was a patchwork kingdom, recently expanded, politically volatile, and economically uncertain. Carol arrived on the throne in 1930 with a playboy reputation, a history of scandals, and a talent for bending institutions around himself. What followed was less a reign and more a decade-long experiment in how to convert a constitutional monarchy into a family business. From the beginning, Carol was not shy about the fact that he wanted money, and lots of it. He had already burned through his allowance as a prince. As king, he elevated his mistress, Magda Lupescu, and a group of cronies into what the Romanian press called the Camarilla, an informal cabinet of deal-makers, fixers, and influence peddlers. Together, they set up a shadow government inside the palace. State contracts flowed not through ministries but through back channels. Kickbacks became routine. Licenses, monopolies, and concessions were awarded to those who paid up. Judges were shuffled. Police looked away. It was not subtle. Newspapers of the time used words like kleptocracy and protection racket to describe the royal household's activities. The opposition National Peasant Party and the National Liberal Party both accused the palace of running Romania like a racket. Even foreign diplomats, who usually wrote their cables in careful code, described Carol's court as a marketplace. Cabinet ministers who balked at the arrangement were reshuffled. Loyalists were rewarded with lucrative sinecures or outright cash. Carol II also built a cult of personality to disguise the grift. He staged elaborate public ceremonies, sponsored youth organizations, and presented himself as the father of the nation. The king was photographed with workers, veterans, and schoolchildren, while behind the scenes his Camarilla cut deals on timber, oil, and arms contracts. The image was paternal, the reality transactional. By the late 1930s, ordinary Romanians joked darkly that the king collected more taxes privately than the state did officially. The economic cost was severe. State revenues were drained to pay for royal projects, pet charities, and the personal enrichment of the Camarilla. Civil servants went unpaid, while palace insiders grew wealthy. By 1938, when Carol dissolved Parliament and imposed his royal dictatorship, many Romanians suspected the emergency powers were less about protecting the country from fascism and more about tightening his control over its cash flow. Even his abdication in 1940 carried a whiff of self-interest. Facing a national crisis and the territorial losses of Bessarabia and northern Transylvania, Carol fled, taking with him a fortune in jewels, securities, and cash, officially for safekeeping, though few believed he ever intended to return it. He lived the rest of his life in comfortable exile, a man who had left his kingdom bankrupt but personally flush. And yet, Carol's brand of palace-centered corruption wasn't unique. In fact, across Europe at the time, a fellow monarch had perfected his own variation of the palace as market model, turning war, not peace, into an opportunity for influence and profit. That monarch was Alfonso XIII of Spain, whose scandals would help set the stage for a monarchy's collapse. 2 monarchs down, 28 to go, and trust us, it only gets wilder from here. If you're still watching, you clearly have the stamina for royal scandal, so hit that subscribe button to keep this deep dive going. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it over there? Are you watching history fall apart over breakfast? Or is this your midnight descent into madness? Either way, you're in good company. 3. Alfonso III of Spain. Alfonso XIII was born a king and ruled like he never forgot it, even when the country begged him to. From the moment of his birth in 1886, he was technically already monarch, his father having died before he ever saw the light of day. But if Spain expected a messiah, what it got was a meddler with expensive tastes, a gambler in politics and patronage, and a man whose name became synonymous with backroom deals and wartime profiteering. His reign began with promise. The restoration system, a carefully managed two-party shuffle, was already fragile by the time Alfonso came of age, but he seemed eager to embrace his role as a constitutional monarch. Unfortunately, he had an inconvenient habit of leaning in a little too close to government affairs. Cabinet meetings were advised by the king, military decisions were suggested by the king, and state contracts, well, they often passed through royal intermediaries, sometimes mysteriously landing in the hands of friends, allies, or foreign firms with excellent court connections. The real trouble started during the Rif War in Morocco, Spain's colonial disaster of the 1920s. Alfonso's interest in the campaign went far beyond ceremonial. He met frequently with generals, involved himself in strategy, and appeared enthusiastic about Spain's colonial role. But as Spain's soldiers died in the desert, rumors circulated in Madrid that the war had become a lucrative enterprise for those in the king's circle. Supply contracts, transport deals, arms procurement all seemed to pass through a tightly connected web of military men and palace loyalists. Journalists began asking pointed questions. Parliamentarians raised eyebrows, and a deeply unpopular monarch continued to smile for the cameras while the treasury bled. Then came the Straperlo affair. On paper, it was a scandal about a rigged roulette machine. In practice, it was a symbol. The Dutch Jewish inventors of the gambling device sought government approval to operate in Spain. When the interior minister refused, they did what many others before them had done. They went up the food chain, all the way to the palace. Bribes were offered. Allegedly, some were accepted. Letters emerged, suggesting members of Alfonso's family had intervened to push for the concession. The outrage was immediate. Suddenly, the notion that the king's court was selling influence wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a front-page headline. By the early 1930s, Spain was rotting with cynicism. The monarchy, once seen as a stabilizing force after decades of civil unrest, was now viewed as a cartel in royal clothing. Republican parties gained strength, the economy faltered, street protests multiplied, and Alfonso, unwilling or unable to reform, simply watched from his palace windows. In 1931, facing mounting unrest and a sweeping Republican victory in municipal elections, Alfonso fled the country, not formally abdicating, but exiting with a diplomatic shrug. He left behind a constitutional crisis, a bitterly divided nation, and a monarchy that would not return until the Franco regime decided it needed a new heir. Yet Alfonso's model of corruption, not through brute tyranny, but through slow institutional decay, was hardly original. In fact, one of his own ancestors on the Spanish throne had turned favoritism and bribery into an art form long before the roulette scandal ever hit the press. That king, Ferdinand VII, didn't just tolerate corruption, he built an entire restoration on it. 4. Ferdinand VII of Spain. Ferdinand VII returned to the Spanish throne in 1814 like a man walking back into his favorite gambling den, where the house always won, because he was the house. Having spent the Napoleonic years in comfortable exile while Spanish resistance forces fought, starved and bled in his name, he came back not as a grateful constitutional monarch, but as an absolutist with a grudge. And as it turned out, revenge, like everything else in Ferdinand's Spain, came with a price tag. He tore up the liberal constitution of 1812 within weeks of reclaiming power, sending reformers and constitutionalists into prison or exile. What followed was a reign so riddled with patronage, bribery, and official plunder that even conservative Spanish elites began to wince. Ferdinand treated the government like a pawn shop, selling, mortgaging, and leasing every scrap of authority he could get his hands on. Posts in the civil service weren't earned through exams or merit, but auctioned to the highest bidder, with the understanding that the buyer would recoup the investment through fees, bribes, or extortion. Customs offices, legal appointments, military ranks, all available for the right price. Contemporaries didn't have to whisper about it. They wrote about it. Deputies in the Cortes, foreign observers, even members of Ferdinand's own administration described the court's atmosphere as one of transactional rot. The royal circle wasn't just venal, it was proudly so. Ferdinand handed out monopolies like party favors, tobacco farming in Cuba, salt production in Spain, foreign trade with the colonies, all became vehicles for enrichment by royal allies. The problem wasn't hidden, it was normalized. The king's infamous favoritism only made things worse. Power centered not in the ministries, but in the salons of his mistresses, the drawing rooms of unqualified confidants, and the alcoves of those who knew how to flatter, pay, or threaten their way into the royal ear. Reforms were introduced and discarded as quickly as they could be sold. The bureaucracy ballooned not to serve the people, but to create more offices to sell. The idea of public service became a euphemism for private collection. This wasn't just about corruption in the abstract, it had material consequences. Ferdinand's misrule accelerated the collapse of Spain's overseas empire. As colonial administrators emulated the mother court's predatory habits, trust in the Spanish crown withered. Independence movements exploded across Latin America, fueled in part by the blatant financial exploitation of royal officials. Ferdinand's court, too busy lining its own pockets, lost entire continents without seeming to notice. Even in his final years, when illness and political instability gripped the kingdom, Ferdinand clung to power through deals, betrayals, and bribes. He died in 1833, leaving behind a country hollowed out by 2 decades of pay-to-play governance and a succession crisis that would ignite the Carlist Wars. His daughter, Isabella II, would inherit not just the throne, but the deep rot beneath it. But while Ferdinand turned corruption into high art, he wasn't the only monarch to treat state resources like a personal checkbook. Across the Adriatic, a self-styled king in one of Europe's youngest states would push the same principle to new and often absurd lengths. His name was Zog I of Albania, and he didn't just raid the state coffers, he brought a suitcase. 5. Zog I of Albania. Zog I of Albania wasn't born into royalty. He constructed it around himself like a fortress. The man who began life as Ahmet Muhtar Zogoli rose from provincial Ottoman nobility to prime minister, president, and finally king, crowning himself in 1928 in a monarchy of his own invention. But for all the ceremonial titles and theatrical oaths, what Zog really built was less a throne and more a safe, and he held the only key. Albania in the early 20th century was a geopolitical orphan, newly independent, perennially unstable, and deeply exposed to foreign influence. Zog recognized this fragility not as a threat, but as an opportunity. With weak institutions and little public accountability, he ruled like a banker managing a shaky offshore account. Centralized control, high secrecy, and a convenient blurring of lines between public funds and private fortune. At first, he presented himself as a reformer. He wore Western suits, dined with diplomats, and promised modernization. But behind the polished veneer, Zog constructed a system of governance rooted in patronage and rent-seeking. Government concessions, from mining rights to tobacco monopolies, were traded like poker chips to friends, relatives, and foreign investors willing to grease the right hands. Parliament became a stage set. Civil service became a loyalty program. Every economic opening in the state was a door that led somehow to Zog's inner circle. The press, to the extent it existed, was kept on a short leash. Journalists who criticized the regime were harassed or exiled. Ministers who asked too many questions were reshuffled or retired. State budgets were opaque and frequently massaged. Foreign loans, most notably from Italy, came with little oversight, but plenty of side deals. The money flowed into infrastructure, yes, but also into the royal court's lifestyle. Lavish receptions, gilded furniture, and a personal security apparatus so large that at one point Zog had more bodyguards than active duty soldiers. Contemporaries noticed. British and French observers stationed in Tirana quietly reported that Zog's court operated more like a commercial syndicate than a government. Rumours swirled that foreign business licenses were only granted after substantial under-the-table payments. Contracts mysteriously went to firms with links to the royal family. And while Albania remained one of the poorest countries in Europe, Zog's personal fortune seemed to rise with each passing year. The moment of truth came in 1939, when Mussolini's Italy, nominally a protector, increasingly a puppeteer, invaded Albania. Zog, who had been slowly surrendering economic sovereignty to Italian interests for years, now faced a military occupation. Rather than stay and fight, he fled, reportedly with multiple cars, a royal entourage, and according to contemporaries, a large portion of Albania's gold reserves. Whether he stole it or secured it remains a debate that no court has resolved, but few Albanians at the time were in the mood for nuance. Zog spent the rest of his life in exile, living comfortably in Egypt, then France. He never saw Albania again. His image there shifted from ambitious reformer to cautionary tale, a man who built a monarchy only to hollow it out from the inside. But Zog was not alone in treating national wealth like a private inheritance. To the south, another royal, this one born into a centuries-old dynasty, was taking the same playbook and applying it to a very different kind of empire. In Egypt, Farouk I would perfect the art of turning a state into a vault, with a little more flair and a lot more scandal. 6. Farouk I of Egypt. Farouk I. He came to the throne in 1936 as a teenager with a British education, an inherited empire, and the adoration of millions. Egyptians saw in him a symbol of rebirth, a modern Arab king who might finally cut the strings of colonial influence and restore national pride. Instead, what they got was something far more familiar, an increasingly extravagant monarch presiding over a palace that looked less like a government and more like a gold-plated auction house. Corruption wasn't just a side effect of Farouk's court, it was the organizing principle. State power under his reign came bundled with an invisible surcharge, paid out through favors, family connections, and kickbacks. Appointments to ministerial positions often required not just loyalty, but lubrication, the kind that came in envelopes, land grants, or luxury cars. Bureaucrats learned quickly that merit was optional, but proximity to the palace was everything. It didn't take long for public perception to turn. By the early 1940s, Cairo's cafes and newspapers buzzed with stories of missing assets, rigged contracts, and the slow disintegration of Egypt's institutions. Farouk's personal collection of vintage automobiles grew suspiciously fast, even as state budgets shrank. His royal court took on the feel of a private club stocked with businessmen and hangers-on who treated public agencies like revenue streams. Licenses, permits, import rights. Everything had a price, and the cash rarely made it into official ledgers. Among the most persistent rumors was that Farouk had a particular fondness for acquiring rare coins, antiquities, and artwork, not through museums or auctions, but often directly from state collections or private owners, under circumstances that were at best murky. Stories circulated of items simply vanishing from public institutions and later surfacing in the king's private vaults. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or entirely accurate, the public perception stuck. Egypt had a monarch who governed like a collector, hoarding treasures while his country struggled to modernize. The military, which had grown increasingly disillusioned with both British interference and royal indulgence, took note. So did civil servants, students, and members of the growing nationalist movement. They watched as the monarchy cozied up to elites and foreign investors, signing deals that benefited royal insiders but left ordinary Egyptians behind. One particularly damning episode involved wartime food shortages. While bread prices rose and distribution faltered, shipments of luxury goods to the palace continued uninterrupted. By the early 1950s, the discontent could no longer be managed with PR campaigns or charity drives. The Free Officers movement, led by young military figures like Gamal Abdel Nasser, began plotting the monarchy's removal. In 1952, the revolution came quickly. Farouk was forced to abdicate and sailed off into exile. Aboard the royal yacht, reportedly with dozens of trunks, paintings, and valuables in tow. He would die in Rome in 1965, overweight, overfed, and largely forgotten, a symbol of everything the Republic had vowed to erase. But for all his excess, Farouk had simply inherited a model. The roots of Egypt's financial decay went back further, to a dynasty that had first entangled itself with European creditors and concession seekers in the 19th century. And no figure embodied that entanglement more than the grand architect of Egypt's debt spiral himself, Isma'il Pasha, the Khedive who dreamed of modernity but paid for it with the country's future. 7. Isma'il Pasha, Khedive of Egypt. Ismail Pasha didn't invent corruption in Egypt, but he certainly professionalized it. When he assumed the title of Khedive in 1863, he came bearing a grand vision, a modern Egypt that would rival Europe, dazzle the world, and serve as the bridge between East and West. Streets would be straightened, canals carved, palaces gilded, ministries born, and all of it, the railroads, the schools, the opera houses, would bear the unmistakable stamp of his personal ambition. And that ambition came with a very specific price tag. At first, the spending spree looked like progress. The Suez Canal was completed. Cairo was redesigned in the image of Paris. Factories opened, infrastructure spread, but behind the elegant facades lay a mountain of invisible costs. The money for these projects didn't come from Egypt's treasury, or at least not from it alone. It came from a complex web of foreign loans, debt restructurings, and concessions. And every transaction left behind a trail of middlemen, many of whom were linked directly to the Khedive's own household. European banks, especially in France and Britain, were more than willing to lend to Ismail's regime, often at rates that would make a modern credit card blush. In exchange, they secured favorable contracts, import licenses, and monopolies. The Khedive's close advisors, and occasionally his own relatives, were rumored to be pocketing commissions on nearly every deal. State revenues were often pledged in advance, leaving less and less available for ordinary administration. Egyptians noticed. Reform-minded bureaucrats, intellectuals, and merchants began to speak out, albeit cautiously. They pointed to the ballooning debt, the rise in foreign influence, and the suspicious disappearances of public funds. Taxes rose sharply, especially in rural areas, prompting unrest among peasants already struggling under traditional levies. Meanwhile, the Khedive's court continued to throw lavish events, build opulent residences, and expand the bureaucracy, not for efficiency, but to create more positions to sell. Ismail had a particular gift for diplomatic evasion. When foreign powers complained, he made grand promises of reform. When local critics protested, he invoked nationalism and his modernizing mission. But the numbers couldn't lie forever. By 1876, Egypt's debt had skyrocketed from roughly 3 million to over 90 million pounds sterling, a staggering leap in just over a decade. Creditors demanded control. That same year, the Caisse de la Dette Publique was established, placing key parts of Egypt's economy under joint Anglo-French supervision. Ismail had essentially sold Egypt's future to protect his present. In 1879, under mounting international pressure, the Ottoman Sultan formally deposed Ismail and replaced him with his son Tawfiq. The former Khedive went into exile, still wealthy but politically neutered, a man remembered, less for his dreams than for the ruin they left behind. Yet Isma'il's story wasn't just a tale of vanity spending. It revealed a broader pattern of rulers treating national modernization as a profit-making venture, where every factory had a financier and every reform came with a receipt. And this pattern, as it turns out, wasn't confined to Egypt. Just east of Isma'il's sphere, another monarch had perfected the art of turning economic concessions into personal income. In Iran, Naser al-Din Shah Qajar had already begun selling his country piece by piece. One monopoly, one foreign lease, one scandal at a time. 8. Naser al-Din Shah Qajar of Iran. Naser al-Din Shah ruled Qajar Iran for nearly half a century, from 1848 to 1896, an impressive tenure if you measure success by duration alone. But if you ask the merchants of Tehran, the clerics of Qom, or the constitutionalists who would later rise in open revolt, the real legacy of his reign was something else entirely: the systematic liquidation of Iran's economic sovereignty, not through war or invasion, but through contracts, concessions and favours, most of them signed behind closed doors, with a suspicious number of signatures returning to the royal household. From the outside, Naser al-Din Shah projected the image of a modernizing ruler. He travelled to Europe multiple times, met with monarchs, and was fascinated by photography, railways, and telegraphs. But modernization, in his hands, functioned less as national reform and more as an opportunity for personal enrichment. Nearly every attempt to modernize came with a side deal, and many of those side deals were so blatantly one-sided that even foreign diplomats admitted the arrangement smelled of personal kickbacks. One of the earliest and most infamous examples was the granting of sweeping monopolies to foreign financiers. Telegraphs, banking rights, road construction, mineral rights, even the trade of alcohol and tobacco, all were sold off to European individuals or companies, often for lump sum payments or vague promises of future investment. These concessions weren't the result of competitive bidding or public planning. They were quiet deals, sometimes arranged through intermediaries that funneled wealth and leverage out of Iran and into foreign hands and palace pockets. The tobacco concession of 1890 was the scandal that finally broke the spell. Naser al-Din Shah granted exclusive rights over the production, sale and export of tobacco to a British company, essentially privatizing the entire industry in favor of one foreign entity, and doing so without consultation. Tobacco was a major part of Iran's economy, touching merchants, farmers and consumers across all classes. When the concession was announced, it triggered an immediate and widespread boycott. And this wasn't just a minor protest. Merchants shut their shops, religious scholars issued fatwas condemning the deal, ordinary citizens stopped smoking, not because they wanted to, but because they refused to let the crown commodify yet another piece of their livelihood. It was one of the first mass political movements in modern Iranian history, and it worked. Under pressure, the Shah revoked the concession in 1892, but by then, the damage, both reputational and institutional, had been done. Critics of the court weren't limited to radicals. Even conservative voices began to question the wisdom of a monarch who seemed more interested in selling Iran than governing it. Behind the palace walls, Naser al-Din Shah remained, insulated, surrounded by flattery and tribute. But on the streets, he became a symbol, not of strength, but of a country up for sale. When he was eventually assassinated in 1896 by a disillusioned follower of the new constitutionalist movement, his death shocked the court, but not the country. Many Iranians had already written him off as a monarch who had bartered away their future in exchange for short-term prestige and private profit. And yet, the selling didn't stop with him. His successor, Mozaffar al-Din Shah, inherited more than a throne. He inherited the habit, and as Iran's economic situation worsened, so too did the scale of the concessions, the brazenness of the deals, and the public's appetite for revolution. 9. Mozaffar al-Din Shah Qajar of Iran. If Naser al-Din Shah sold the country one concession at a time, his son Mozaffar al-Din Shah picked up the habit and industrialized it. Where his father had at least cloaked his backdoor dealings in the language of modernization, Mozaffar didn't bother with theatrics. His reign, from 1896 to 1907, became a cautionary tale of how a state can rot not through conquest or collapse, but through quiet agreements, each one legal on paper, each one deeply corrosive in practice. From the moment he took power, Mozaffar al-Din inherited not just a throne, but a financial crisis. His father's reign had left Iran deeply indebted to foreign creditors, especially British and Russian banks, and the new Shah had little interest in belt tightening. He wanted money, urgently and often, for palace expenditures, luxury imports, and frequent European tours. And because domestic revenue wasn't enough to fund his appetites, he reached for the most convenient option. He sold off more pieces of Iran's sovereignty. One of the earliest signs of trouble came with the infamous Darcy oil concession in 1901. The Shah granted a British subject, William Knox Darcy, exclusive rights to prospect, extract and export petroleum across nearly the entire country for 60 years. In exchange, a one-time payment of £20,000, a modest cut of future profits, and the promise of development. It was, by almost any standard, a breathtaking giveaway. Darcy would later parlay this deal into the creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, a behemoth that would dominate Iran's energy sector for decades. And it didn't stop with oil. Mozaffar al-Din's court sold banking rights to Russian interests, customs administration to foreign advisors, and infrastructure contracts to companies that operated less like partners and more like proxy governors. Foreign post offices functioned openly in major cities. Iran's national sovereignty was becoming a patchwork of flags, each one representing a slice of the economy that no longer answered to the state, but to a boardroom abroad. Inside Iran, outrage grew. Clerics, merchants, journalists, and ordinary citizens began to link the court's venality to the country's stagnation. It wasn't just about the economy anymore, it was about dignity. Why, people asked, was the Shah bartering away national assets for personal pleasure? Why did customs revenue vanish into palace accounts while roads crumbled and schools languished? Newspapers circulated biting critiques of court life. Pamphlets denounced the monarchy's dependency on foreign money. Even conservative religious leaders began to denounce the Shah's corruption in sermons. By 1905, protests had turned into demands. The constitutional revolution erupted, uniting unlikely allies, the merchant class, the clerical establishment, and nascent secular reformers, in a call for a national assembly, transparency, and limits on royal authority. Reluctantly and under immense pressure, Mozaffar al-Din signed the 1906 constitution and allowed the formation of the Majlis, Iran's first elected parliament. But it was a short-lived victory. The Shah died just months later, leaving behind a country racked with internal tensions and foreign entanglements, and a parliament still struggling to assert itself against entrenched royal privilege. His legacy, a dynasty increasingly seen not just as outdated, but as willing accomplices in the foreign partitioning of Iran's economy. And yet, this was only the overture. For the next Qajar successor, and later the Pahlavis, the pattern would continue, albeit with different tools, more sophisticated mechanisms, and bigger stakes, because by the mid-20th century, Iran wasn't just bartering tobacco or oil, it was swimming in it. And Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah, would turn royal corruption into an empire-wide institution, built not just on sales and concessions, but on the machinery of the modern state itself. 10. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shah of Iran. By the time Mohammad Reza Pahlavi took the throne in 1941, Iran had already seen its monarchy trimmed, challenged, and briefly sidelined. His father, Reza Shah, had built a centralizing modern state with steel fists and questionable bookkeeping, only to be forced into exile by the British during World War II. Mohammad Reza inherited the crown with far less authority and far more pressure. But what he lacked in constitutional power, he would later compensate for through an expansive oil-fueled architecture of royal control, built not just on charisma, but on foundations, monopolies, and meticulously routed streams of money. In public, the Shah presented himself as a modernizer. He liked helicopters, white gloves, Western suits, and televised development plans. His regime launched grand infrastructure projects, university expansions, and a program famously called the White Revolution. But under the glossy facade was a financial labyrinth where royal interests quietly entwined with the very arteries of the state. Critics didn't need to invent stories. Most of the corruption was hiding in plain sight. At the center of it all were the so-called Pahlavi foundations, tax-exempt royal-run institutions that held vast business assets across multiple sectors: banking, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, media, and more. These were not philanthropic foundations in the conventional sense. Though they occasionally dispensed charity and sponsored cultural events, they functioned more like state-backed investment portfolios with minimal oversight. The most prominent of these, the Pahlavi Foundation, controlled billions in assets and acted as a holding company for the Shah's financial empire. Members of Parliament and foreign observers alike questioned how such an institution, supposedly meant to serve the public good, had become one of the most powerful economic entities in Iran. Even more concerning was how these royal financial interests interfaced with foreign contracts, especially in the oil sector. Iran's petroleum wealth, nationalized in the early 1950s, and then largely brought back under Western control after the 1953 CIA-backed coup, became a river of revenue that flowed directly to the royal state. Transparency was elusive. Senior military officials, cabinet ministers, and royal relatives often sat on the boards of state-owned enterprises, or the private firms that won the juiciest government contracts. Kickbacks were rumored to be standard operating procedure. Opposition newspapers, before being shut down, accused the monarchy of not just tolerating corruption, but institutionalizing it. As the economic gap widened in the 1970s, amid booming oil prices and conspicuous consumption by the elite, resentment grew. Tehran's bazaars buzzed with stories of royal relatives securing exclusive import licenses or bending the justice system to settle private disputes. Land reforms were accused of being rigged for elite buyouts. Even some within the regime quietly warned the Shah that the perception of unchecked palace wealth was becoming combustible. But the Shah didn't bend. Surrounded by sycophants and convinced of his divine mission to elevate Iran, he brushed off the warnings. He built more palaces. He staged even grander celebrations, most notoriously the 1971 Persepolis Bash, where the royal court wined and dined foreign dignitaries in a tented city of imported luxury, just miles from impoverished villages. By the late 1970s, the social contract had ruptured. What had started as whispers turned into mass demonstrations. Revolution was no longer a theory, it was a countdown. In 1979, the monarchy fell, and the Shah fled into a restless exile, carrying with him not just the memories of a toppled dynasty, but the lingering suspicion that much of Iran's vast oil wealth had slipped through the hands of the people it was supposed to uplift. Yet even the Pahlavi court, with its modern business networks and foundations, was following an old playbook, one pioneered across dynasties and continents. Long before Iran's royal oil economy came under fire, another royal household had been accused of misdirecting state funds and enriching itself while its navy sank into ruin. In Qing-era China, Empress Dowager Cixi would face allegations that fused corruption, resistance to reform, and imperial grandeur into one enduring controversy. 11. Empress Dowager Cixi of Qing China. In the twilight years of the Qing dynasty, amid foreign incursions, internal rebellions, and mounting economic stress, a single figure towered over the imperial court: Empress Dowager Cixi. She was not the emperor, but she may as well have been. As regent for two successive child emperors, she wielded near absolute power behind the throne for almost 5 decades. And while Chinese historians still argue over her political legacy, there was one thing that united her critics across time and ideology: the sense that under her watch, corruption became not just tolerated, but expected. Cixi began her ascent in the Forbidden City through cunning court alliances and a keen sense of survival. Once in power, she set about consolidating control over the levers of the imperial machine. Officially, she was a guardian of Confucian order. Unofficially, she presided over one of the most nepotistic and graft-ridden bureaucracies in Chinese history. The problem wasn't simply that corruption existed, that had always been a feature of dynastic rule, but that under her regency it seemed to flourish at the very top. A common thread in contemporary criticisms, particularly from reform-minded officials, was the Empress Dowager's failure or refusal to rein in financial abuse within the court. Positions in the civil service, especially at the provincial level, could be bought for a price. These offices often came with unofficial rights to extract wealth from the local population, usually through bribes, kickbacks, and manipulated tax assessments. Reformers sent memos. Some resigned in protest. Others were quietly removed or ignored. One of the most enduring allegations involved the misappropriation of naval funds. In the 1880s, the Qing dynasty attempted to rebuild its naval power to counter growing foreign threats, particularly from Japan. The Beiyang fleet, in theory, was to become a modern force capable of defending China's coastlines. But according to multiple contemporaneous sources, funds earmarked for shipbuilding, ammunition, and training were diverted or siphoned off through inflated contracts and phantom expenditures. Rumors circulated, never officially confirmed but widely believed, that Cixi had repurposed a substantial portion of the naval budget to renovate and expand the Summer Palace, her personal retreat north of Beijing. Whether the full extent of this reallocation is historically accurate remains a matter of scholarly debate. But what is undeniable is that when war did come, notably with Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95, the Chinese Navy was catastrophically unprepared. Ships were outdated, ammunition was in short supply, morale was low. The fleet collapsed quickly, and with it, much of China's standing in East Asia. Critics inside and outside the empire connected the dots. What kind of court, they asked, prioritizes marble balustrades over national defense? Cixi responded to such allegations with selective purges and public charity projects. She portrayed herself as the mother of the nation, a tireless caretaker balancing tradition and survival. But beneath that image, many saw a court that rewarded loyalty over competence, cronyism over merit, and opulence over sustainability. By the end of her regency in 1908, the dynasty was on life support. Provincial authority had grown stronger than the centre. Reform movements, some constitutional, others revolutionary, were gaining ground. The idea of imperial rule itself was starting to crack. When the Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1912, only 4 years after her death, many looked back at Cixi's court as the symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a regime too inward-looking, too self-indulgent, and too entangled in its own graft to survive. But Cixi's system had willing enablers, some of them royal, many of them just as enterprising. Among them was Prince Qing Yi Kuang, a high-ranking Manchu noble and statesman who learned that in the dying days of empire, the most valuable commodity wasn't power, it was access, and he sold it by the ounce. 12. Prince Qing Yikuang of the Qing dynasty. If Empress Dowager Cixi was the matriarchal architect of late Qing power, then Prince Qing, also known as Yikuang, was her most reliable contractor, not in the sense of building empires, but in knowing exactly who to sell them to. A senior Manchu noble and one of the highest-ranking statesmen of his time, Prince Qing lived comfortably at the intersection of ceremonial authority, foreign diplomacy, and private gain. In a crumbling dynasty, increasingly unable to govern itself, he became the face of a uniquely refined version of corruption, polished, bureaucratic, and utterly shameless. Born into the Aisin-Gyoro imperial clan, Prince Qing rose through the ranks with speed and ease, thanks to both blood and an unshakable talent for court survival. By the late 19th century, he had positioned himself as one of the empire's chief intermediaries with foreign powers. He served as head of the Zongli Yamen, the Qing Foreign Office, then later as the head of the powerful Grand Council. To outsiders, he was a calm, cautious negotiator, but inside China, reformist voices and even imperial officials whispered a different story, one of backdoor deals, favors sold, and national humiliation administered one contract at a time. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900, in which anti-foreign insurgents and Qing troops laid siege to foreign legations in Beijing, ended in catastrophe. When the Eight-Nation Alliance invaded and imposed crushing reparations through the Boxer Protocol, Prince Qing, who had kept his distance from the rebellion itself, was chosen to lead the peace negotiations. He played the part of the pragmatic statesman. And yet, when the dust settled, many noticed that Prince Qing had not only survived the chaos, but somehow emerged more powerful and personally wealthier. One of the most serious allegations from contemporaries was his role in selling government offices. Under his leadership, it was widely believed that appointments to the civil service, especially in customs, provincial posts, and foreign missions, were often determined not by merit or exam, but by discreet payments. These weren't mere rumours. Reform-minded bureaucrats wrote letters to the throne, merchants complained in petitions, and even some foreign advisers noted the frequency with which underqualified candidates suddenly acquired prestigious posts. Worse still, Prince Qing was accused of skimming funds from the very foreign indemnities he helped negotiate. Vast sums flowed into the Qing court to cover the costs of the Boxer reparations. While some of these were earmarked for military reform or infrastructure, insiders alleged that a significant portion disappeared into the hands of court intermediaries. Contracts for reconstruction, railway building, and even diplomatic functions became sources of personal enrichment for those close to him. Unlike many corrupt officials, Prince Qing never fell dramatically. He didn't flee the country, stage a last-minute reform, or face public trial. He simply stayed in place, adapting to the political winds with remarkable skill. When the Qing court attempted a final round of constitutional reforms in the early 20th century, Prince Qing was appointed the first prime minister of the newly created imperial cabinet, a move widely criticized as symbolic of everything wrong with the regime. Reformers mocked the decision, noting that the man tasked with modernizing China was the same figure they accused of selling it off piecemeal. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, Prince Qing quietly faded into political obscurity, dying in 1917 without scandal or ceremony. But his legacy lingered, not in the form of dramatic betrayal or political upheaval, but in the subtle, corrosive idea that power was less about leadership and more about brokerage. He had monetized influence so effectively that by the time the dynasty collapsed, many officials no longer saw corruption as deviance, but as the default setting of governance. And while Prince Qing embodied corruption as aristocratic routine, another monarch, further south, in a rising nation-state grappling with identity and modernity, would lean into royal spending and patronage with theatrical flair. In Thailand, Rama VI Vajiravudh turned kingship into a stage play with the budget footed by the state. 13. Rama VI Vajiravudh of Siam, Thailand. When Rama VI, also known as Vajiravudh, ascended the throne of Siam in 1910, he did so as a thoroughly Europeanized monarch, a product of British education, elite institutions, and classical theatre. He spoke fluent English, wrote plays in Shakespearean style, and saw himself not only as a king, but as a dramatist of national identity. Unfortunately for Siam's treasury, he also acted like a producer with unlimited credit, casting himself in every leading role and using state funds to finance the performance. Rama VI didn't inherit a broke kingdom. His father, King Chulalongkorn, Rama V, had initiated major reforms, centralizing the state, modernizing institutions, and keeping the colonial powers of Britain and France at bay through diplomatic agility. But his son approached modernization through a different lens, cultural nationalism laced with expensive symbolism and lavish spending. If Chulalongkorn had been the architect of administrative reform, Vajiravudh was the interior decorator, convinced that a stronger national identity could be built from costumes, slogans, and grand gestures, no matter the price tag. His court quickly gained a reputation for eccentric extravagance. Royal projects multiplied, monuments, state pageants, and theatrical productions, many written by the king himself, consumed disproportionate amounts of public money. He founded the Wild Tiger Corps, a paramilitary organization styled more like a personal militia meets Boy Scout troop than a professional force. Its headquarters were luxurious, its uniforms custom-made, and its loyalty explicitly tied to the king. Critics in the press, parliament, and even within the bureaucracy saw it as a vanity project funded through public coffers. But it wasn't just pageantry. Behind the culture campaigns was a sprawling network of royal favoritism. Court appointments became increasingly political and personal. Promotions often bypassed experienced civil servants in favor of loyalists, flatterers, or theatrical collaborators. Budgets ballooned in the royal household while funding for ministries lagged. Government officials, particularly in the finance and audit departments, quietly voiced concerns about unsustainable spending and unaccounted funds. Rama VI's generous patronage also extended to those within his social circle. Close associates were granted prestigious posts and lucrative concessions despite having minimal qualifications. Economic decisions, from infrastructure contracts to trade licenses, increasingly revolved around personal access to the throne. This climate of favoritism, coupled with a lack of institutional oversight, eroded confidence in both the monarchy and the government's fiscal discipline. Outside the palace walls, ordinary citizens began to feel the pinch. Tax burdens increased and economic stagnation crept in. The press, which had enjoyed a degree of freedom in the earlier reign, became more vocal and, in response, more targeted by censorship. Editorials questioned why so much was spent on plays and palaces while schools and hospitals struggled. The image of a king of the people began to fracture under the weight of theatrical excess and mounting deficits. By the 1920s, the disconnect was clear. Vajiravudh had aimed to cultivate a unified national identity, but many saw only a royal court increasingly detached from the realities of governance. When he died in 1925, leaving behind a massive personal debt that the state was forced to absorb, his legacy was not one of triumph but of overreach. A monarch who cast himself as a national saviour while running the kingdom like a private theatre troupe. And yet even Vajiravudh's reign, with its flamboyant misallocations, paled in comparison to the raw accusations levelled against one of his predecessors. a king who had once ruled a fractured Siam and was ultimately deposed by those who claimed his corruption had crossed from palace indulgence into outright seizure. That king was Taksin of Thonburi, whose dramatic fall was less a change of government and more an act of national exorcism. 14. King Taksin of Thonburi. King Taksin's reign sits at an uneasy intersection of national myth and political cautionary tale. To some, he was a unifier, the warrior king who, in the chaotic aftermath of Ayuthya's fall to the Burmese in 1767, rallied the remnants of a shattered Siam and forged a new capital in Thonburi. To others, especially those who witnessed the final years of his rule, he was something far less noble, a monarch who blurred the line between statecraft and personal power to such an extent that his court began to resemble a fortress of paranoia, privilege, and private gain. Taksin came to power as a military savior, and he wielded authority like a man who believed the nation owed him everything. In the beginning, his rule was marked by rapid expansion and consolidation. He crushed rival factions, reopened trade routes, and restored a semblance of centralized governance. But as the throne solidified beneath him, so too did a pattern of behavior that raised eyebrows among his contemporaries, increasing isolation from advisors, growing extravagance, and a court culture that drifted steadily into the realm of personal enrichment. Contemporary chronicles, particularly those compiled by the eventual victors, speak of a king who became increasingly erratic, surrounding himself with sycophants while punishing critics and rivals. But behind the political purges and spiritual eccentricities lay a quieter, more systemic rot, the alleged seizure of land, wealth, and property under royal pretexts. Merchants and officials reportedly had their assets confiscated under vague charges or sudden royal decrees. Trade privileges were redistributed, not through institutions, but through personal favor. Royal projects absorbed vast resources, often with little transparency or return. Revenue collection under Taksin became a particularly contentious issue. His rapid military campaigns and palace expenses demanded constant funding, and it is said that tax collectors operated with extraordinary leeway. Accusations emerged that officials loyal to the crown were exploiting the system to enrich themselves, seizing property, demanding bribes, or inventing debts, all under the vague protection of royal authority. Whether Taksin directly orchestrated these policies or simply allowed them to fester remains debated, but the effect was the same. Resentment simmered across social classes. Perhaps most damning were the murmurs that Taksin began to treat state wealth as indistinguishable from his own. Royal treasuries, temple donations, military spoils, all seemed to flow into a palace whose doors were increasingly closed to audit or scrutiny. The king's spiritual declarations in his final years, some interpreted as claims to divinity, only amplified the concerns. To many, it seemed that Taksin no longer saw himself as a servant of the realm, but as its living embodiment, entitled to rule not just the people, but everything they owned. In 1782, the tension reached a breaking point. A coup, led by one of his own top generals, Chao Phraya Chakri, later Rama I, overthrew Taksin. Official justifications pointed to madness, misrule, and corruption. The new regime swiftly moved to delegitimize his legacy, executing him and rewriting the narrative. Yet, the speed and severity of his downfall suggest that public discontent ran deeper than mere palace intrigue. His fall was not just a shift in dynasties, it was a judgment on a model of kingship that treated power as property. And while Taksin's story ended in dramatic reversal, his brand of royal extraction would reappear elsewhere, this time dressed in imperial robes and financed by a European power. In the heart of Africa, a ruler crowned by himself as emperor would turn state corruption into a performance so theatrical and grotesque that even his foreign patrons winced. That man was Jean-Bedel Bokassa, and his empire was less a government than a bank account wrapped in medals. 15. Jean-Bedel Bokassa, Emperor of the Central African Empire. If absolute power corrupts absolutely, Jean-Bedel Bokassa seemed determined to test the theory by adding velvet capes, diamond-studded thrones, and unpaid invoices. His reign, first as president, then as self-declared emperor of the Central African Empire, was less a chapter in African political history and more a cautionary tale written in gold leaf and ledger lines. When he crowned himself in 1977 with a ceremony modelled on Napoleon's coronation and paid for almost entirely with public funds, the world looked on in stunned amusement. The people of the Central African Republic, however, were not laughing. Bokassa rose through the ranks as a military man under French colonial rule and later became head of the army in the newly independent Central African Republic. In 1966, he seized power from President David Dacko in a bloodless coup, promising discipline and order. What followed was a descent into one of the most baroque kleptocracies in modern African history. At first, his rule carried the usual trappings of post-colonial strongmen, a cult of personality, close ties with France, and increasingly centralized authority. But Bokassa took things further. He didn't just rule the state, he consumed it. National resources were diverted into personal accounts, foreign aid packages mysteriously evaporated, and government contracts were handed to French firms that returned the favor with gifts, commissions, and support. For a nation rich in diamonds but desperately poor in infrastructure, the imbalance was jarring. The most spectacular example of Bokassa's excess came with his coronation as emperor in 1977, a three-day event that devoured an estimated 1/3 of the national budget. The regalia was imported from France, custom-made robes, gem-studded crowns, fleets of luxury cars, and even a throne shaped like a golden eagle. The bill was astronomical, the symbolism imperial, and the funding taken from a state that couldn't afford textbooks for its schools or medicines for its hospitals. Foreign dignitaries largely declined to attend, but the message to his own people was clear. Their leader was now a monarch, and the treasury was his inheritance. Behind the theatrical absurdity, the corruption was systematic. Bokassa's control over the country's diamond trade was near total. Mines were either nationalized or handed to foreign firms, with generous cuts reserved for the palace. State revenues flowed through shadowy accounts, while ministers were shuffled, silenced, or co-opted into the system. Those who tried to challenge the corruption, civil servants, judges, even military officers, found themselves sidelined, or worse. Bokassa didn't govern by ideology, he governed by appetite. Despite widespread domestic discontent, his regime remained propped up for years by foreign allies, most notably France, which viewed him as a strategic partner in Francophone Africa, but even that alliance had limits. In 1979, after years of scandal, repression, and economic collapse, the French government withdrew support. In a swift operation known as Barracuda, French paratroopers flew in and removed him while he was out of the country, restoring his predecessor, David Dacko, to power. Bokassa fled into exile, leaving behind palaces full of unused luxury goods and a state budget in ruins. He would later return to stand trial, where among the many charges levelled against him, corruption remained central. Embezzlement, theft of public funds, misuse of authority, all became part of the long indictment not only of a man, but of a system that had allowed one individual to live as emperor while the nation crumbled beneath him. But Bokassa's story wasn't an isolated anomaly. His methods, extravagant self-enrichment, sale of national concessions, rule by personal entourage, echoed across royal courts from the Sahel to the Atlantic. And just to the northwest, in the fading shadows of Morocco's pre-colonial monarchy, another ruler was preparing to do much the same. Mule Abdelaziz, Sultan of Morocco, would earn a reputation not just for weakness, but for transforming his court into a revolving door of foreign speculators, bought loyalty and economic implosion, all under the illusion of modern rule. 16. Mule Abdelaziz of Morocco. When Mule Abdelaziz took the Moroccan throne in 1894, at the age of 16, he was hailed by some as a fresh-faced reformer, a young ruler stepping into the modern era, eager to pull his ancient kingdom into the currents of progress. He had European advisors, newfangled technology at court, and a fascination with all things Western, from cameras to bicycles. But if his reign began with the image of promise, it ended in something closer to foreclosure. Behind the modern trappings lay a pattern of relentless concession selling, elite favoritism, and a monarchy that began functioning less like a sovereign institution and more like a brokerage house for foreign interests. Abdelaziz inherited a fragile throne. Morocco was under increasing pressure from European powers, especially France, Spain, and Germany, each eager to stake claims to influence, resources, and trade routes. Instead of resisting this pressure with reform or institutional resilience, Abdelaziz's court leaned into it by monetizing it. Faced with growing fiscal shortfalls and internal unrest, the Sultan and his entourage began selling access to the kingdom's economy, customs rights, resource concessions, tax farms, even security arrangements. If a foreign financier or company wanted a piece of Morocco, the price was negotiable, as long as someone close to the palace got their cut. What began as pragmatic diplomacy quickly metastasized into systemic corruption. A rotating cast of foreign advisors and local power brokers surrounded the Sultan, each pushing for deals that funneled money into narrow pockets while starving the broader state. Key economic functions, like customs collection and tariffs, were outsourced to European syndicates. Loans were taken at ruinous rates, often to pay off older debts or finance superficial palace improvements. Within a few years, significant portions of Morocco's national income were effectively mortgaged to outsiders. The Moroccan elite took notice, and not kindly. Fez and Marrakesh buzzed with discontent. Religious leaders, tribal notables, and urban merchants began to question the legitimacy of a ruler who seemed more accountable to Paris and London than to his own people. The ulama, religious scholars, issued veiled condemnations. Uprisings flared in the hinterlands. Meanwhile, the palace remained insulated, distributing gifts and titles to loyalists while treating criticism as sedition. Abdelaziz's personal conduct didn't help. Though not accused of violent tyranny, he was widely seen as aloof, distracted, and overly influenced by European tastes and intrigues. Stories circulated, some true, others embellished, of the Sultan spending hours with foreign guests while ignoring urgent matters of state, or frittering away resources on symbolic displays while the countryside starved. His credibility eroded not through scandal, but through slow, visible decay. The monarchy no longer appeared sovereign, but sold. By 1907, Morocco was in chaos. Nationalists accused the palace of having auctioned the country. The public's patience collapsed. The following year, Abdelaziz was formally deposed in favor of his half-brother al-Hafid, who came to power on a wave of popular anger and anti-corruption rhetoric. The change in leadership, however, was more cosmetic than structural. Abdelaziz lived out his remaining years in relative comfort, quietly fading from public life. A man who had once ruled a kingdom and somehow lost it to paperwork. Yet the pattern didn't end with his abdication. His successor, Abdel-Hafid, took power with promises to end foreign domination and palace venality. But once in control, he quickly found that selling concessions and currying foreign favor was not only convenient, it was profitable. The faces changed, but the financial logic stayed the same. The next chapter in Morocco's royal history would be less about reform and more about refinancing. 17. Ahmed III of the Ottoman Empire. When Sultan Ahmed III came to the throne in 1703, the Ottoman Empire was already a vast and aging machine, still powerful, still expansive, but visibly creaking under the weight of its own contradictions. The military was restless, the bureaucracy bloated, and the provinces increasingly difficult to control. Yet for nearly 3 decades, Ahmed presided over one of the most culturally vibrant periods in Ottoman history, a time remembered as the Tulip Era, named after the imperial court's obsession with the delicate flower. But beneath the gardens and poetry, something else was blooming, a deeply entrenched network of favoritism, luxury, and court corruption that would eventually blow up the palace gates, literally. The Tulip Era, 1718 to 1730, was a time of surface reform and deepening rot. On the one hand, it was a moment of innovation. The first Ottoman printing press was authorized, European embassies expanded their influence, and members of the ruling elite began importing French styles, architecture, and sensibilities. On the other hand, the cost of this gilded modernization fell squarely on the people, not through transparent governance or development, but through the invisible siphons of court privilege. Under Ahmed III, the Ottoman bureaucracy became a series of toll booths for anyone hoping to move goods, gain office, or receive justice. Civil and military posts were routinely sold to the highest bidder, often with the understanding that the buyer would recoup their investment through bribes, extortion, or creative taxation. The mechanisms of graft weren't crude. They were refined, ritualized, and woven into the fabric of administration. To be appointed Qadi, judge, or mutaselim, tax collector, didn't just mean serving the empire, it meant buying a license to extract value from the population. Ahmed himself was not a tyrant in the traditional sense. He was urbane, cultured, and surrounded by poets, scholars, and architects. But he was also detached from the economic burden his court imposed. Lavish palace gardens, ornate fountains, and opulent festivals were funded through increasingly aggressive taxation and opaque financial dealings. Istanbul's artisans, shopkeepers, and janissaries, once the engine of urban stability, began to mutter that the empire's resources were being drained not for defense or reform, but for silk robes and imported wine. At the heart of this ecosystem was the Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, Ahmed's close relative by marriage and the de facto manager of the state. Ibrahim Pasha was both admired and despised, praised for his diplomatic skill, but condemned for the rampant nepotism and financial mismanagement under his administration. Critics accused him of turning the state into a family enterprise, handing out sinecures and contracts to his own clan and allies. Taxes were farmed out to private collectors who paid upfront fees to the court, and then wrung whatever they could from the countryside, often with brutal efficiency. The backlash came not from foreign enemies, but from within. In 1730, a revolt led by a former janissary named Patrona Halil swept through the capital. The rebels denounced the court's corruption, its European tastes, and the extravagant spending that had become synonymous with the Tulip Era. Ahmed III was forced to abdicate. Ibrahim Pasha was executed. The grand festivals stopped, the tulips were trampled, and yet the problem hadn't been tulips. It had been the way the court treated governance as theatre, where loyalty was bought, not earned, and public money was used to stage the illusion of prosperity. A change in sultans didn't fix that. The same system, the same temptations, the same courtly indulgences, they remained. And nowhere were those temptations more violently indulged than under Ahmed's distant successor, a sultan whose reign was marked not by poetry and refinement, but by erratic behavior and open exploitation. Ibrahim I, known to history as the Mad, would preside over a court so chaotic and corrupt that even the empire's most jaded chroniclers struggled to describe it without disbelief. 18. Ibrahim was the Mad of the Ottoman Empire. The story of Ibrahim I, the 18th Ottoman Sultan, is often told as a tragedy of mental instability and palace intrigue. But that telling, while not entirely inaccurate, conveniently leaves out something far more systemic. Under Ibrahim's erratic rule, the Ottoman court didn't just drift into chaos. It metastasized into a palace-run extraction machine, where every institution seemed to serve one of two purposes, pleasure or profit, and often both. Ibrahim came to the throne in 1640 after years of confinement in the infamous Kayfes, or cage, a secluded section of the palace where royal princes were kept under house arrest to prevent power struggles. After nearly 2 decades of isolation, he emerged deeply paranoid, easily manipulated, and ill-prepared for governance. But the real danger wasn't just the man. It was the opportunistic system that rose around him. With the Sultan's focus elsewhere, court officials, palace favourites, and members of the imperial harem effectively took over the state's financial levers, and they knew exactly how to pull them. One of the first signs of decay came through the imperial treasury. Chroniclers of the time noted that vast sums were spent on court luxuries, including costly imports, custom garments, and elaborate entertainments. But behind the indulgence lay a network of influence trafficking. Positions at court, from military governors to tax collectors, were openly bought and sold. Appointees, knowing their tenure depended more on bribes than performance, treated their posts as temporary licenses to plunder. Ibrahim's grand viziers, the empire's top administrators, were replaced at a dizzying pace, often depending on which faction held sway in the palace that week. Each change came with a price. New ministers brought new entourages, new debts, and new demands for tribute. Court factions formed and dissolved rapidly, all competing for the same shrinking pool of imperial favour. The result was administrative paralysis, where policies were made not through deliberation but through bargaining. Perhaps the most glaring example of Ibrahim's detachment was his reliance on palace intermediaries, particularly within the harem. His favourite concubine, known as Shivakar Sultan, was widely reported to wield enormous influence, not just over domestic matters but over appointments and state spending. Her patronage network became a shadow government, dispensing favours and orchestrating dismissals. The palace, already notorious for its factionalism, turned into a court of private enrichment. Meanwhile, public dissatisfaction grew. In Istanbul and beyond, pamphlets, poems and sermons criticised the moral and financial decline of the empire. The Janissaries, once elite soldiers and now increasingly politicized, openly complained about unpaid wages and corrupt commanders. Merchants and provincial governors sent letters to the capital protesting arbitrary taxes, the auctioning of judicial posts, and the collapse of lawful administration. But no serious reform came. The machinery of the empire had been co-opted, and the man at the top seemed both unable and unwilling to stop it. By 1648, patience had run out. A coup, backed by senior military officials and religious leaders, deposed Ibrahim. He was imprisoned and later executed. A rare fate for an Ottoman sultan, and a mark of just how deeply the political class had lost confidence in him. But the execution didn't reset the system. The courtiers, ministers and financiers who had profited under Ibrahim weren't purged. They merely rearranged themselves around the next sultan, because, as it turned out, the real problem wasn't madness. It was the normalization of corruption under the guise of royal privilege, and that normalization would continue under yet another Ottoman ruler whose name would come to be associated not with insanity, but with the economic unraveling of the empire itself. Abdelaziz, reigning 2 centuries later, would bring the imperial treasury to its knees, not through war, but through contracts, loans, and a palace that never stopped spending. 19. Abdelaziz of the Ottoman Empire. When Abdelaziz ascended the Ottoman throne in 1861, the empire was deep in the middle of the Tanzimat reforms. a sweeping, decades-long attempt to modernize the Ottoman state and avoid becoming Europe's next colonial casualty. Reforms were meant to clean up governance, rationalize taxation, streamline administration. But under Abdelaziz, the modernization dream took a sharp detour, one lined with expensive railroads, overpriced warships, and ballooning debts, most of which conveniently enriched the palace and a tightly connected circle of contractors, financiers, and favorites. Abdelaziz was no fool. He understood the optics of reform, and he made them a performance. He traveled to Europe, shook hands with monarchs, and admired their industrial cities and modern navies. When he returned to Istanbul, he wanted the same, or at least the appearance of the same. The empire launched ambitious infrastructure projects, including railways, telegraph lines, and a vast naval buildup. But the implementation wasn't led by careful planners. It was orchestrated by those who saw opportunity in imperial aspiration and a monarch eager to make a mark. The results were spectacular and spectacularly expensive. The Ottoman navy became the third largest in the world, its docks filled with ironclads and steam-powered warships. The cost of this naval expansion alone consumed vast sums, much of it borrowed from European banks. Deals were often sealed through personal relationships, without competitive bidding or budgetary oversight. Ministers close to the Sultan funneled contracts to foreign suppliers, many of whom padded costs generously. Allegations of inflated invoices and consulting fees, the polite 19th century term for kickbacks, were rampant. At the same time, Abdelaziz poured money into personal projects. New palaces and royal residences sprang up along the Bosphorus. The most famous, the Dolmabahce Palace, became a symbol of grandeur and waste. Imported materials, extravagant furnishings, and endless maintenance costs drained the treasury, while the state struggled to meet even basic obligations in the provinces. More than just architectural indulgence, these construction projects became pipelines for corruption, with contracts awarded to loyalists and palace-linked businesses. Budgets ballooned, oversight was minimal, and accountability virtually non-existent. The financial strain quickly showed. By the mid-1870s, the Ottoman Empire was so indebted to European creditors that it could no longer make payments. Interest on existing loans consumed the majority of state revenue. In 1875, the empire formally defaulted. It was a moment of humiliation, marking the beginning of direct foreign financial oversight. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, established shortly thereafter, essentially handed the empire's fiscal sovereignty to European powers. Meanwhile, discontent grew. Bureaucrats complained of non-payment. Soldiers went months without salaries. Journalists published biting editorials about the palace's unchecked spending and the strange coincidence that those closest to the throne seemed the only ones untouched by hardship. Abdelaziz's reign, once advertised as a new era of progress, had become synonymous with fiscal collapse and mismanagement. In 1876, amid rising political unrest and a series of economic protests, Abdelaziz was deposed in a palace coup orchestrated by ministers and military leaders who had finally reached their limit. His fall was swift, and the official reason was incompetence. But behind the veil, it was about money and the court's inability to stop bleeding it. Yet even as Abdelaziz exited the stage, the structure he had helped fortify, a top-down economy riddled with personal favors, debt-fueled projects, and unchecked contracts, remained fully intact. And in the princely state of Baroda, far from the Ottoman world, another royal was just getting started on a corruption scandal so egregious it would involve British colonial courts, attempted poisoning, and accounting books that read more like criminal dossiers. His name was Malhar Rao Gaikwad, and even in an empire built on corruption, he stood out. 20. Malhar Rao Gaikwad of Baroda. In the vast, dizzying quilt of princely India under British rule, some rulers were celebrated for their cultural patronage. others for administrative skill, and a few, like Malhar Rao Gaekwad of Baroda, became infamous for turning governance into something closer to a crime syndicate. Appointed in 1870 as the ruler of one of the wealthiest princely states in the subcontinent, Malhar Rao inherited a throne with real power and substantial revenue. What he did with both was so brazen, so poorly disguised, and so corrosive that even the British, typically tolerant of princely indulgence as long as loyalty remained intact, were forced to intervene. From the outset, Malhar Rao seemed more interested in looting than leading. Within months of assuming power, reports began surfacing of embezzlement from state treasuries. Salaries for civil servants were delayed or vanished entirely, even as the Maharaja's personal expenditures exploded. British residents stationed in Baroda, who were tasked with monitoring the state's administration, began filing increasingly concerned reports. Expenditures bore no resemblance to revenues. State funds were being redirected without documentation. Audits, when attempted, were stonewalled. The heart of the issue was Malhar Rao's treatment of the state as private property. Appointments were made based on bribes or personal favours. Contracts were handed out with no competitive bidding. Public works projects saw little progress, but plenty of invoices. Land rights, import licenses, and tax exemptions were available for a price. The Maharaja's close circle benefited the most. A network of favourites and relatives who, according to British accounts, treated Baroda's finances like a personal ATM. Attempts by honest officials to intervene were met with intimidation or dismissal. What pushed the entire affair from scandal to diplomatic crisis, however, was an alleged attempted poisoning. In 1874, Robert Fair, the British resident at Baroda, filed a formal complaint not just about financial irregularities, but about attempts on his life, specifically that he had been given contaminated sherbet under suspicious circumstances. The accusation was serious, if sensational. A British inquiry followed, during which witnesses described erratic behaviour, threats, and explicit efforts to silence or remove any oversight of the Maharaja's financial affairs. Whether the poisoning claim was entirely credible or not, it sealed Malhar Rao's fate. In 1875, the British convened a formal commission of inquiry. The resulting investigation was damning. Records showed massive embezzlement, unexplained withdrawals from public funds, and outright theft. Some of the expenditures were absurd, even by princely standards. At one point, Malhar Rao had ordered a solid gold cannon, not for defence, but as a display piece, paid for directly from the state budget. Court officials testified that the Maharaja had blocked any attempt at oversight and had reshuffled his administration to ensure maximum financial opacity. The British government, embarrassed and increasingly alarmed, made the rare decision to depose a reigning Indian prince. Malhar Rao was removed from the throne in 1875 and exiled. He lived the rest of his life outside of Baroda, his name remembered less for royalty than for ridicule. A walking cautionary tale about what happens when unchecked power meets unfiltered greed. And yet, the story didn't end there. For while the British prided themselves on deposing one corrupt ruler, they had themselves helped elevate another, a man whose alliance with the East India Company had been secured not through policy or popularity, but through outright bribery. His name was Mir Jafar, and in the story of colonial India, no name became more synonymous with betrayal, backroom deals, and corruption dressed as diplomacy. 21. Mir Jafar, Nawab of Bengal. In the long and often cynical history of colonial entanglements, few figures carry the weight of infamy quite like Mir Jafar. Installed twice as Nawab of Bengal, first from 1757 to 1760, and again from 1763 to 1765, Mir Jafar was not simply a local ruler who lost to European powers. He was the man who greased the hinges on the door that would swing wide open to British rule in India. And while his legacy is usually framed as one of betrayal, it's more accurately described as a transactional deal gone terribly right for his foreign backers and terribly wrong for the region he ostensibly ruled. The story begins, as most colonial footholds do, with a war disguised as commerce. In the mid-18th century, the British East India Company was no longer just trading spices and silk, it was building armies, funding campaigns, and brokering power struggles among local rulers. Bengal, the richest province in Mughal India, was governed at the time by Siraj-ud-Dowlah, a young ambitious Nawab who made the mistake of confronting British ambitions head-on. In response, the company turned to Mir Jafar, a disgruntled commander in Siraj's court, offering him the throne in exchange for betrayal. The deal was explicit. In return for turning on Siraj-ud-Dowlah during the pivotal Battle of Plassey in 1757, Mir Jafar would be installed as Nawab. He agreed. The battle was lost before it began, and Siraj was swiftly defeated. With company troops still camped nearby, Mir Jafar was crowned. It was a coronation not of sovereignty, but of servitude, and everyone involved knew it. Once in power, Mir Jafar had a problem. The promises he'd made were expensive. The East India Company demanded hefty reimbursements for military costs, diplomatic favours, and protection services. To meet those demands, the new Nawab opened the floodgates of extraction. Offices were sold, contracts were handed out in exchange for loyalty. Revenue collectors were appointed not based on merit, but on how much they could funnel back to the court, and from there to the company. The result was catastrophic for Bengal. With the administration hollowed out by graft and royal favour, the economy began to buckle. Merchants were harassed, peasants overtaxed, and justice became a matter of price. British officials, who had once claimed to be neutral commercial partners, now exercised enormous control over the province's finances. Mir Jafar, realizing he had created a monster he could no longer manage, attempted to push back, reaching out to the Dutch for support in a desperate bid to rebalance power. It failed. In 1760, the company deposed him and replaced him with his son-in-law, Mir Qasim. But politics in Bengal were as unstable as the ledgers, and 3 years later, the British found Mir Qasim too independent for their taste. They reinstalled Mir Jafar on the throne, a puppet they knew how to manage. He returned, older and diminished, his second reign even more compromised than the first. More concessions were granted, more offices were sold. The court became a marketplace, and the Nawab its cashier. By the time of his death in 1765, Mir Jafar had become a byword for betrayal, not just in political terms, but in moral ones. His name entered Indian folklore and vocabulary as shorthand for a traitor, but the truth was more complicated. He had played the game the British offered him and lost. The corruption of his court wasn't an aberration. It was the foundation of British rule in India, built not with cannon fire, but with contracts, bribes, and royal signatures. And yet, while Mir Jafar is remembered as the man who sold out a kingdom, he was not the last princely figure to do so. Further west, in the opulent courts of Punjab's royal elite, a new generation of Indian princes would emerge. Men whose extravagance was measured in Rolls-Royces, jewel-encrusted bathtubs, and private cricket fields funded by public money. One of the most notorious was Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala, a ruler whose lifestyle outpaced not just his subjects' means, but even his empire's revenue. 22. Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala. If royal corruption had an Olympic event, Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala would have not only taken home the gold, he might have insisted on designing the medals himself, studded them with diamonds from the state treasury, and then hosted a 10-day victory banquet with taxpayer money. Ruling from 1900 to 1938, Bhupinder Singh was one of the most flamboyant Indian princes of the British Raj, a larger-than-life figure whose taste for opulence was matched only by his creative accounting. His court was famous not just for extravagance, but for treating the distinction between state funds and personal spending as a mere formality, one that could be waived with the right title, the right party, or the right guest list. Bhupinder Singh's public image, especially in British circles, was carefully cultivated. He was known as a modernizer, a military ally, and a patron of sports. He was the first Indian ruler to own a private aircraft, built lavish palaces like Moti Bagh, and even fielded his own cricket team, the Patiala 11, stocked with international players and equipped with uniforms that made county sides look like schoolboys. He loved fast cars, women, cigars, and jewelry, and he didn't believe any of it should be kept modest. But behind the spectacle was a financial operation that many of his contemporaries, both Indian and colonial, described as systematic looting. His rule was marked by rampant misuse of state funds for personal indulgence and a palace environment where nepotism was policy. Court positions were handed to loyalists or sycophants, often with no discernible qualifications. Justice in Patiala was said to favour proximity over law. If you had the right connections at court, the legal system would bend accordingly. State budgets, such as they were, became increasingly opaque. Spending on royal ceremonies, architectural vanity projects, and diplomatic gifts ballooned, often without oversight. Audits were rare, and when British officials did conduct them, as they occasionally were forced to, they found significant discrepancies. One infamous episode involved a colossal necklace commissioned from Cartier, reportedly paid for out of the state's treasury, and presented at a European gala as a personal purchase. It wasn't just showmanship, it was financial theatre, funded by taxes levied on a largely agrarian population. More troubling than the spending itself was the atmosphere it created. Court insiders, contractors, and foreign dealers quickly learned that the fastest path to profit was through flattery and favoritism. Concessions, licenses, and resource rights could be negotiated or gifted, depending on how well one performed in the court's unspoken talent show. Meanwhile, civil infrastructure suffered. Roads went unpaved. Rural areas lacked basic services. And while the Maharaja threw banquets for visiting dignitaries, famine relief and rural health programs were relegated to afterthoughts. Of course, Bhupinder Singh's defenders would argue that he was simply playing the game, keeping up with colonial pomp, buying prestige in a system designed to reward spectacle. But the numbers didn't lie. By the 1930s, Patiala's debts were mounting, and internal documents revealed growing concerns about the sustainability of its finances. When Bhupinder Singh died in 1938, he left behind a legacy of ornate architecture, legendary parties, and an administrative model that would haunt his successors. The British, ever eager to avoid rocking the princely boat, looked the other way, as they had with so many rulers who cloaked corruption in silk robes and state dinners. But halfway across the world, on an island thousands of miles from the Indian subcontinent, another king was facing a crisis of confidence, one not rooted in diamonds or palaces, but in scandal after scandal, involving bribes, licenses, and political strong-arming. King Kalakaua of Hawaii, once hailed as a nationalist modernizer, would end up signing away his own power after accusations of corruption transformed his court from a seat of sovereignty into a cautionary tale. 23. Kalakaua, King of Hawaii. David Kalakaua, crowned King of Hawaii in 1874, began his reign as a figure of hope, a Hawaiian-born monarch determined to revive the island's cultural identity, modernize its infrastructure, and reclaim the dignity of a people increasingly boxed in by colonial pressures. But the same reign that started with chants of sovereignty and native pride would, within a decade, become mired in accusations of corruption, cronyism, and a creeping commodification of royal power. Kalakaua's court, though vibrant and ambitious, became synonymous with the sale of influence, as political access, state contracts, and even entire monopolies were quietly brokered behind palace doors. Kalakaua motivations were complex. He wanted to modernize Hawaii, building roads, expanding trade, commissioning public works, and even envisioning a pan-Pacific alliance of indigenous monarchies. But modernity came with bills, and the Hawaiian treasury was not a bottomless well. As expenses mounted and foreign pressure intensified, Kalakaua turned to a familiar and ultimately ruinous solution: monetizing the monarchy. Perhaps the most emblematic scandal of his reign was the infamous Opium License affair. In 1886, it emerged that Kalakaua had issued a lucrative license to import and distribute opium, a tightly controlled and highly profitable commodity, under suspicious circumstances. The license went not to the highest bidder, nor to a public agency, but to a Chinese businessman closely tied to palace insiders. Investigations revealed that large sums of money had exchanged hands during the process, with credible accusations that a portion of the funds had ended up in Kalakaua's personal accounts or had been used to settle royal debts. The king's inner circle dismissed the story as political slander, but public trust was badly shaken. Other questionable deals followed. State appointments increasingly went to friends, donors, or well-connected foreign merchants. Government contracts, including those for public utilities and sugar concessions, were handed out without transparency. While Kalakaua entertained European royals and planned grand voyages abroad, many Hawaiian citizens began to see their king as a man increasingly out of touch with his own kingdom. The optics were damning. Extravagant coronation ceremonies and ambitious construction projects, including the lavish Iolani Palace, were funded while state services withered and political tension escalated. But it was the so-called salary bill that arguably broke the back of public patience. In 1887, Kalakaua proposed a bill to significantly increase the salaries of cabinet ministers, most of whom were his own appointees and loyalists, and himself. Critics argued it was a thinly veiled attempt to legalize corruption by paying off allies with taxpayer money. The backlash was swift. A coalition of businessmen, American settlers, and disillusioned nobles formed a new political bloc, and armed with both popular support and foreign muscle, they confronted Kalakaua directly. The result was the imposition of the 1887 Bayonet Constitution, so called because the king signed it under threat of force. This new constitution stripped the monarchy of much of its power, transferring real control to the cabinet and legislature, now dominated by elites more aligned with foreign interests than with the native Hawaiian population. Kalakaua remained king in name, but his role had been reduced to that of a ceremonial figurehead. He died in 1891 during a trip to San Francisco, leaving behind a legacy that still divides historians. Some view him as a victim of imperialist pressure, a monarch trying to navigate impossible contradictions. Others see him as a ruler who sold out his kingdom's autonomy not through conquest, but through contracts. Either way, the story of Kalakaua echoes far beyond the Pacific, because just a few decades later, on the North African coast, another monarch, this one draped in oil wealth and Western backing, would oversee a palace where influence was not just bought and sold, but inherited like currency. Idris I of Libya would turn a new nation's optimism into a monarchy of favors, padded contracts, and petrodollars quietly redirected into the shadows. 24. Idris I of Libya. When Idris I was crowned King of Libya in 1951, the moment was steeped in symbolism. Libya had just emerged from decades of Ottoman control, Italian colonization, and Allied occupation. Idris, a religious leader from the influential Senussi order, was seen by many, both at home and abroad, as a unifying figure, pious, measured, and relatively untainted by the chaos of the preceding years. But as Libya transitioned from colonized territory to independent kingdom, a familiar dynamic took root. The promises of transparency, justice, and national development were quickly overshadowed by growing allegations of royal favoritism, economic mismanagement, and a palace that operated more like a gatekeeping firm than a guardian of the public interest. At first, the problems seemed manageable. Libya was a poor country with minimal infrastructure and deep regional divisions. Idris's initial reliance on foreign advisors and British backing was expected, even rational. But when oil was discovered in commercial quantities in the late 1950s, the calculus changed. Libya was suddenly wealthy, flush with petrodollars that promised a golden era of development. Instead, the sudden windfall revealed just how vulnerable the monarchy was to the oldest temptation in governance, the quiet rerouting of public wealth into private hands. Throughout the 1960s, critics, including former officials, journalists, and foreign observers, began pointing to an unmistakable pattern. Oil revenues were being funneled into opaque state funds, many of which were controlled directly by the royal court or by Idris's close associates. Economic concessions, including extraction rights, construction contracts, and trade monopolies, were regularly awarded without bidding, often to companies with direct connections to palace insiders or foreign intermediaries with a history of facilitating deals. Reports from the time describe a government riddled with patronage. Ministers were shuffled in and out depending on their personal relationships with the king or his inner circle. Provincial governors acted like satraps with limited accountability to Tripoli. Civil servants complained of being passed over in favor of those with royal patronage. And as Libya's oil income skyrocketed, so did the wealth and influence of Idris's family and entourage, many of whom appeared to gain access to state funds without clear portfolios or oversight. The resentment wasn't just about money, it was about visibility. In Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan, the country's three historical regions, young officers and students began to ask why a monarchy that claimed religious humility lived in palatial residences, travelled abroad for medical treatment, and maintained an increasingly expensive security apparatus. Corruption became a frequent topic in university lectures, coffeehouse debates, and internal government reports. It was a quiet crisis, but it was growing louder by the year. By the late 1960s, opposition to the monarchy was no longer limited to grumbling intellectuals. A generation of young military officers, many of whom had trained abroad and returned with modernist pan-Arabist ideas, began organizing in secret. They viewed Idris's regime as stagnant, out of touch, and hopelessly compromised by foreign oil interests and domestic rent-seeking. On September 1st, 1969, they acted. While the king was in Turkey for medical treatment, a group of junior army officers, led by a 27-year-old Muammar Gaddafi, launched a coup. The monarchy fell within hours, without a shot fired. Idris never returned to Libya. He would die in exile in Cairo quietly, a monarch who once symbolized national unity but became, in the eyes of many, the personification of squandered potential. Yet Idris was not the only 20th century monarch to wrap corruption in the robes of tradition. Just a few hundred miles northeast in the Balkans, another king had perfected the art of governing through backroom deals, padded concessions, and state-fueled self-indulgence. Milan IV of Serbia, armed with foreign loans and diplomatic doublespeak, would turn his reign into a masterclass in how to sell a country's future, one railway contract at a time. 25. Milan I of Serbia. Milan I of Serbia, crowned king in 1882 after ruling as prince since 1868, was many things. A modernizer, a schemer, a gambler, and, perhaps most enduringly, a monarch whose reign became a textbook example of how political instability and personal indulgence can intersect to produce a distinctly Balkan brand of corruption. His rule unfolded during a period when Serbia was trying to reinvent itself, caught between Ottoman decline, Austro-Hungarian ambition, and its own post-feudal growing pains. Milan saw himself as the man to pull Serbia into modern Europe. What he actually did was sell chunks of it to foreign investors, rack up debts, and turn the government into a playground for favoritism and financial leakage. From the very beginning, Milan's reign was dogged by questions about money, not just state money, but his own. He lived lavishly, travelled frequently, and developed a well-known habit of wagering more than he could afford. His personal debts, especially those incurred during extended stays abroad, were often quietly paid off through extraordinary budget allocations approved by his inner circle. Serbian taxpayers, meanwhile, were told this was the price of modernization, but Milan's financial improprieties weren't limited to royal extravagance. The real engine of his corruption was Serbia's rapid industrialization, especially in the railway sector. In the 1880s, as the government sought to build a national railway network, Milan negotiated a series of deals with Austro-Hungarian firms, ostensibly to modernize the country's infrastructure, but the contracts were wildly skewed in favor of the foreign companies. Terms included inflated construction costs, long-term tax exemptions, and guaranteed profits. Serbian critics argued that the state had essentially mortgaged its future to Vienna, and, more quietly, that members of the Obrenović court had received personal kickbacks for facilitating the deals. The press, increasingly emboldened during this period, began reporting on suspicious payments, no-bid contracts, and the inexplicable rise in wealth among royal advisers. Parliamentary sessions turned combative. Deputies demanded audits. Milan responded with classic strongman tactics, dissolving parliament, reshuffling cabinets, and accusing his critics of subversion. But the more he tried to assert control, the more transparent the palace's financial entanglements became. There were also persistent rumours that Milan had accepted payments from foreign governments, particularly Austria-Hungary, in exchange for favourable policies and diplomatic alignment. While hard evidence remained elusive, the alignment was unmistakable. Serbia's economy became increasingly dependent on Austro-Hungarian trade, and its political decisions began tilting eastward. To many Serbians, Milan had not just mismanaged the country, he had sold its independence by installments. By the late 1880s, domestic unrest was growing. Protesters took to the streets, calling for constitutional reform and accusing the king of squandering the nation's sovereignty. Milan's popularity cratered. In 1889, he abruptly abdicated in favor of his son Alexander, claiming exhaustion and the desire to retreat from public life. Most observers suspected otherwise, that the mounting criticism, combined with political pressure from abroad and scandal fatigue at home, had finally made the crown too heavy to bear. He lived out his remaining years as a political advisor and diplomat, never quite leaving Serbian affairs alone. But history remembered him less as a modernizer and more as a cautionary tale. A monarch who wanted to be European royalty, but ended up as a middleman in his own country's decline. And yet, Milan was not the last ruler to cloak personal profit in the language of national progress. Further south, in the sun-drenched court of Naples, another king, Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies, was using state monopolies and security forces not just to govern, but to extract. His version of corruption would be less about contracts and more about coercion. A state where justice came with a price tag and royal favour was the only currency that counted. 26. Ferdinand II and Bomba of the Two Sicilies, nicknamed King Bomba, after allegedly ordering the bombardment of rebellious citizens in Messina, Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies ruled from 1830 to 1859 with a style that combined absolute monarchy, secret police, and good old-fashioned profit-taking. His public image was one of stern paternalism, a king who believed deeply in the sanctity of order, the dangers of liberalism, and the need to keep the peninsula's restless cities tightly leashed. But behind the patriotic speeches and iron-fisted governance was a court run less like a government and more like a tightly controlled financial racket, where state institutions existed to serve the crown's appetite for loyalty, obedience, and, most crucially, revenue. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, encompassing southern Italy and Sicily, was at the time one of the most populous and resource-rich territories in the Italian peninsula. But under Ferdinand II's rule, its resources were locked behind a wall of royal favoritism and bureaucratic opportunism. The king surrounded himself with a circle of trusted confidants, nobles, advisors, clerics, many of whom were rewarded not with ceremonial roles but with actual power, monopolies, trade licenses, and administrative appointments that brought both prestige and profit. Corruption under Ferdinand wasn't haphazard, it was systematized. State monopolies, including salt, tobacco, and sulfur, were managed by entities directly tied to the crown. Licenses for mining, shipping, and customs were routinely granted in exchange for loyalty and quiet tribute. Independent merchants and landowners who refused to play along found themselves targeted by tax audits, denied permits, or caught in webs of legal obstructionism. The justice system, such as it was, became one of the monarchy's most potent tools for economic coercion. The royal courts also offered a lucrative side hustle in the form of offices for sale. Positions in local administration, judiciary, and even the army could be obtained through discreet payments. It was an open secret in Naples that getting anything done, from securing a permit to avoiding an investigation, required more than just paperwork. It required connections, and it often required cash. Judges ruled based not only on evidence but on influence. Prosecutors took instructions not from law but from the palace. Political opponents, reformists, and critics who spoke out against this rot were handled bluntly. Ferdinand's secret police network monitored university professors, clergy, foreign visitors, and anyone suspected of liberal leanings. Arrests were frequent, trials were opaque, and exiles piled up. Foreign diplomats, particularly the British and French, sent home reports of a court mired in backwardness, repression, and corruption. One British observer described the regime as a government where bribery is the oil and silence the price. Ironically, Ferdinand fancied himself a modernizer. He invested in infrastructure, such as railways and telegraphs, but these projects often served as yet another way to enrich court insiders. Contracts were awarded without competition, costs mysteriously ballooned, and the quality of construction was often poor. The appearance of modernization masked the deeper truth that progress under Ferdinand II was a commodity like any other, available for purchase if the buyer had the right passport, the right title, or the right last name. By the time of his death in 1859, the arrote had spread too far. The kingdom was brittle, inward-looking, and isolated, a sitting duck for the waves of revolution that would soon wash over Italy during the unification campaigns. Just a year later, Giuseppe Garibaldi's red shirts would sweep through Sicily and the south with startling ease, welcomed by citizens tired of corruption and repression, wrapped in the language of divine right. But Ferdinand II wasn't the only ruler who let religious legitimacy and royal tradition cloak the corrosion of the state. Further east, in the crumbling Safavid dynasty of Iran, another king, Shah Sultan Hussein, presided over a kingdom where clerics and eunuchs ran amok with public funds, and the state fell not with a battle cry but with a bribe. 27. Shah Sultan Hussein of Safavid Iran. By the time Shah Sultan Hussein ascended to the throne in 1694, the Safavid Empire was already teetering, but what it needed was leadership. What it got was a monarch so indecisive, so easily manipulated, and so utterly disengaged from the realities of governance that his reign became less a story of misfortune and more a study in systemic decay. Sultan Hussein didn't just preside over the fall of an empire, He watched it unravel from the palace windows while his court turned corruption into an administrative principle. He was a deeply pious man, but devotion did not equal competence. Almost immediately, real power at court shifted to palace factions, especially eunuchs, clerics, and courtiers who had mastered the fine art of ruling without ever stepping outside the royal compound. The bureaucracy, already bloated, became a feeding ground for the well-connected. Appointments to provincial governorships, tax farms, and military posts were determined less by experience than by bribery, family connection, or clerical favor. The price of loyalty was negotiable, the price of silence even more so. Under Sultan Hussein, public offices were openly sold. Wealthy families bid for posts as if they were purchasing property, and in many ways they were. A governorship wasn't a job, it was a license to collect. Once installed, officials squeezed local populations through taxes, arbitrary fines, and forced levies, with a portion always kicking back to the capital. There was little fear of oversight. Royal inspectors were easily bribed, and anyone who threatened to expose the system's excesses could be denounced as heretical or disloyal to the Shah, a label that carried more weight than any evidence ever could. Religious authority, so central to the Safavid state, was also compromised. The clerical class expanded rapidly under Sultan Hussein, not as a sign of national awakening, but as a mechanism of control. Mullahs and court theologians gained disproportionate influence, not just over spiritual matters, but in judicial and administrative affairs. Many were placed in charge of endowments and religious courts, which allowed them to amass wealth and settle scores under the guise of legal piety. Reformers and rivals were silenced through accusations of blasphemy or sedition, and economic favoritism became entangled with religious patronage. Meanwhile, the empire's once vaunted military fell into neglect. Forts were undermanned, officers underpaid, and regional forces increasingly answered to local bosses rather than the central state. The royal court spent lavishly on religious festivals, architectural projects, and personal indulgences, while frontiers were left exposed. As Afghan tribes began to press into Safavid territory, the central government did little, not out of malice, but out of institutional paralysis. Decisions stalled, resources vanished, officials bickered over who would fund defences, and more importantly, who would profit from them. In 1722, after years of unchecked decay, the capital city of Isfahan was besieged by Afghan forces. Sultan Hussein surrendered after months of indecision and famine. He abdicated in humiliation and lived out his final years under house arrest. The once mighty empire shattered beneath the weight of its own corruption. His reign marked the end of the Safavid dynasty, but it wasn't a cautionary tale about military defeat. It was about what happens when a state hollows itself out from the inside, when every office is a transaction, and when a king retreats from rule while those around him turn governance into a racket. And yet, corruption wasn't exclusive to the grand imperial capitals. Thousands of miles away, in the royal courts of East Asia, another ruler, this one a Korean monarch named Yeonsangun, was systematically monetizing status, plundering property, and treating his scholars like threats to be silenced and extorted. If Iran's collapse came through clerical favoritism, Joseon Korea's scandal would arrive through sheer authoritarian appetite. 28. Yeonsangun of Joseon Korea. If there is a royal figure in Korean history whose name is nearly synonymous with tyranny and corruption, it is Yeonsangun of the Joseon dynasty, who ruled from 1494 to 1506. His reign is remembered less as a period of leadership and more as a cautionary descent into authoritarian excess, institutionalized bribery, and open plundering of the very foundations that had long supported the Korean state. While he began his rule amid cautious optimism, Yeonsangun quickly dismantled any expectations of good governance, choosing instead to wage a personal vendetta against the state's elite while transforming the monarchy into an engine of profit, paranoia, and personal indulgence. Yeonsangun's early years were shaped by trauma. His mother, Queen Yun, had been executed years earlier under murky court politics, and his resentment toward the bureaucracy, particularly the scholarly elite known as the Sarim, festered into something far more dangerous once he assumed the throne. What followed was less a rule than a purge-driven reign that emptied state coffers, auctioned status, and punished dissent, not with debate, but with confiscation. One of Yeonsangun's most infamous legacies was the systematic confiscation of property. Accusations of sedition, corruption, or even disloyal sentiment were used as pretexts to strip families, especially those tied to previous regimes or reformist scholars, of their wealth, land, and ranks. These purges were not only political, but financial. The crown seized estates, homes, and businesses, redistributing them to court favorites or keeping them for royal use. Officials who helped facilitate these seizures were rewarded not for loyalty to state or law, but for efficiency in enrichment. The royal court under Yeonsangun quickly became an auction house of ambition. Government posts, military commissions, and aristocratic titles were increasingly distributed based not on exam scores or experience, long pillars of Joseon's meritocratic ideals, but on who could pay the right bribe or flatter the right faction. The traditional Confucian bureaucracy, once a balancing force against royal overreach, was decimated. Civil service exams were undermined, and many scholars were either forced into exile or executed during multiple waves of purges, particularly the devastating Sawa literati purges. In their absence, the court became a closed circle of opportunists. Yeonsangun also drained state funds on personal luxuries and projects of questionable public value. He expanded royal palaces and pleasure gardens, imported entertainers, and poured resources into court festivities, while ordinary people struggled under increased taxes and administrative neglect. Local officials, seeing the example set at the top, followed suit. Tax farming became more abusive. Local justice systems grew more arbitrary. The entire bureaucratic apparatus began functioning less as a mechanism of order and more as a vertical pipeline of wealth directed upward toward the palace. Perhaps most chilling was Yeonsangun's assault on the institution of education itself. Outraged by the critical voices emerging from Confucian academies and historical record keepers, he ordered the closure of the Seongyungwan, Korea's highest educational institution, and reportedly destroyed archives and historical texts that documented his mother's fate and, by extension, his own grievances with the state. The court annals, sacred records of Joseon governance, were tampered with. It wasn't enough to erase his enemies, he wanted to erase their memory. By 1506, the excesses had gone too far. A coup led by high-ranking officials and military commanders removed Yeonsangun from power in a swift and bloodless uprising. He was exiled and died not long after. The new regime quickly moved to reverse many of his policies, restore the civil service, and rehabilitate the scholars who had survived. But the scars remained. Yeonsangun left behind a legacy of fear, corruption, and institutional erosion. His reign proved that even in a state built on law, ritual, and hierarchy, a single monarch could, with enough ruthlessness and greed, reduce the system to a transactional shadow of its former self. And as Joseon Korea recovered from its brush with royal autocracy, another empire to the west would face its own post-revolutionary corruption in a different form, under the brief but explosive reign of Agustin II of Mexico. Crowned emperor in a country just learning what independence felt like, Agustin didn't just mimic monarchy, he monetized it, trading honors and influence in a nation barely held together. 29. Agustin de Iturbide, Emperor of Mexico. When Agustin de Iturbide crowned himself Emperor of Mexico in 1822, he wasn't stepping into a long-standing tradition of monarchy. He was inventing one from scratch, with borrowed European aesthetics, hurried rituals, and a crown forged in the confusion of post-colonial power vacuum. Mexico had only just broken from Spanish rule after a bloody war of independence, and its people were not yet sure what kind of country they were building. Agustin offered them an answer. Unfortunately, it came wrapped in vanity, opportunism, and a royal court that behaved less like a government and more like a cash-in-advance operation. Iturbide had originally been a military leader for the Spanish, then switched allegiances at a politically convenient moment. After helping to negotiate the Plan of Iguala and securing independence in 1821, he was celebrated as a national hero. But glory faded quickly, and within months of independence, he grew disillusioned with Mexico's shaky republican prospects, or more precisely, with the limitations those prospects placed on his personal power. In 1822, with the support of a loyalist faction in the army and upper clergy, he declared himself Emperor Agustin I. What followed was less a reign and more a one-year spending spree in imperial drag. In a country still in ruins from war, where the treasury was nearly empty and infrastructure fragile, Agustin set about building a monarchy that looked the part. Palaces, court titles, lavish military uniforms, and a nobility fabricated virtually overnight. Dozens of titles were created, many sold outright to loyalists, family members, or opportunists. Pensions were awarded with no clear funding source. Court positions came with generous salaries, often paid out of emergency funds that should have gone to stabilize the economy. Members of the newly formed Congress began to ask uncomfortable questions. Where was the money going? Why were friends and relatives of the emperor receiving lifetime pensions? Why were land grants being issued to favorites with no public process? The answers never came. Instead, Iturbide dissolved the Congress in late 1822, claiming it had become disruptive and disloyal. This act, seen by many as a bold attempt to cover up financial irregularities and suppress investigations, triggered widespread unrest. Discontent spread quickly. The military, once his core base of support, turned against him. So did former allies in the independence movement. By March of 1823, under immense pressure from all sides, Agustin abdicated and fled into exile. He attempted a return the following year, believing he might reclaim power, but was arrested and executed shortly after landing. His imperial experiment had lasted barely 8 months, yet in that short time he had managed to alienate nearly every political faction, drain what little trust existed in post-independence institutions, and frame monarchy itself as a scam. Agustin didn't fall because he was corrupt. He fell because his corruption was too transparent, too sudden, and too arrogant for a country not yet ready to forget how empires behave. But Mexico wasn't the only country where promises of national revival were undermined by venal opportunism. Just a few years earlier, across the Mediterranean, another royal had made nearly identical pledges to restore dignity, end courtly corruption, and put his country back in native hands. And yet, once in power, Abdel-Hafid of Morocco followed a path so well trodden it left little mystery. It began with reform and ended, predictably, with concession selling, French subsidies, and a monarchy too compromised to survive. 30. Abdel-Hafid, Mule Abdel-Hafid of Morocco. Mule Abdel-Hafid came to power in 1908 as the anti-corruption candidate. That wasn't just political spin, it was the entire basis of his legitimacy. His predecessor and half-brother, Abdelaziz, had earned a reputation for selling Morocco off to foreign interests, granting concessions for cash, and surrounding himself with European advisors who seemed more interested in exploiting the country's wealth than preserving its independence. Abdel-Hafid presented himself as the solution, a pious, principled leader who would restore Moroccan sovereignty, curb venality, and eject the foreign speculators from the palace. It didn't last. Abdel-Hafid's rebellion against Abdelaziz was backed by a wide coalition: tribal leaders, clerics, merchants, and nationalist notables, all of whom expected reform in return for their support. And at first, he delivered gestures that seemed to signal a new era. He purged a few unpopular courtiers, issued proclamations of moral governance, and appeared to distance himself from European financial interests. But behind the scenes, the mechanics of governance were unchanged. In fact, they may have gotten worse. Abdel-Hafid quickly found that the state's finances were even more fragile than he had anticipated. The treasury was nearly empty. Regional governors were growing restive, foreign creditors were demanding payment, and so, with few good options, the new sultan turned to the same playbook his brother had used: selling concessions, accepting subsidies, and trading influence for cash. One of the most glaring examples came in the form of French loans. Despite his anti-colonial rhetoric, Abdel-Hafid agreed to a series of financial arrangements with Paris that gave French officials increased control over Morocco's customs and revenue streams. In return, he received personal financial guarantees and political support. Meanwhile, lucrative contracts for infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, were handed to foreign companies without transparency, often at inflated prices. Moroccan merchants and notables who had once supported Abdel-Hafid now found themselves sidelined, watching as the same foreign hands they'd fought against were welcomed back through the back door. Court politics reverted to old patterns. Access to the Sultan became the most valuable currency in the kingdom. High-level posts were auctioned off, land grants were quietly redistributed to allies, and taxes were manipulated to favor those close to the palace. The press, to the extent that it existed, became increasingly critical and was quickly silenced. Reformist voices who had backed Abdel-Hafid's rise were either co-opted or crushed. By 1912, the contradictions of his rule were no longer sustainable. Popular uprisings erupted across the country, tribes rebelled, urban unrest spread. That same year, Abdel-Hafid signed the Treaty of Fez, formally establishing the French protectorate in Morocco. He abdicated shortly after, in exchange for a comfortable pension from the French Cixi. Final concession, traded not on behalf of the Moroccan people, but for his own security. His fall marked the end of the Sharifian monarchy as a sovereign power. The dynasty would survive under colonial oversight, but Abdel-Hafid's reign had extinguished the illusion of independence. Like so many before him, he had risen on the promise of reform, only to fall in the familiar shadow of personal gain. And so ends the list. But the pattern, of course, does not.